Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Rum, ayah number 21, He says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, He says, وَمِنْ آيَاتِ أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُم مَّوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. Allah says, and of His signs is that He has created for you mates amongst yourselves, companions from amongst yourselves, so you can find peace in them. And then He has placed affection, rahma and mawadda. So love, and rahma means to have compassion, to have mercy, to have kindness towards each other, right? And then he repeats the signs comment where he says, right, inna fi zalika la ayatil liqawmi yatafakkarun. And certainly in this there are signs for the people who give thought or people who contemplate. So today, inshallah, we are going to talk about the issue or the topic of family relationships and marriage. And inshallah, we will, ask some of these questions like, how do we align our lives in today's times with the rulings and regulations of Islam with regards to family and marriage? And how can the rulings of Islam guide us in modern times on how we should conduct ourselves when it comes to family systems? We should also, talk about, and this is something very sensitive going on in United States right now, right? Especially when you looked at the topic of abortion when it came to the Supreme Court with Roe versus Wade, where they completely abolished the right of having abortion. And then they started talking about the right of using contraceptives, for example, to do family control. And then now recently they are talking about using the sperm eggs and qualifying that as life, for example. And then the idea is that the fertilized egg is considered as a life, and then a lot of states are now working. Alabama just passed that rule, and then a lot of states, especially in the Republican-controlled states, they are talking about giving that right. So now you don't even have the right to get rid of that sperm egg. So the question becomes is how does Islam look at it, right? So we should understand from our perspective, right? There is the Christian version of what is life is being imposed, right, on the general population. There was another view which said you had complete freedom to do whatever you want. So what is the actual ruling around Islam with regards to those type of conversations and topics? So we'll talk about family, we'll talk about marriage, and then we'll talk about how to answer some of these controversial topics that are coming in, and what is Islamic perspective, and then what are the things we need to look at. Mashallah, the community now has a lot of young youth, and there's a lot of people getting married, right, very recently. So, and then it's also a good reminder for people who have been married for a long time on how to go about and look at some of these things with regards to how to look at certain topics in Islam, and some of the controversial topics also that get thrown at us, and how do we answer that question. The first and fundamental topic is that the family is the basic unit of Islamic society, right? And then this is where you are born into a family, you live into a family, and then eventually you start your own family. And a family is where you learn things, you learn your values, you learn your religion, you learn your language, you learn your culture, right? So a lot of the education and value systems comes from the family. It is also a place where you're provided a loving atmosphere without anybody judging you as you're growing up, right? And in Islam, at least, it's one of the more legitimate sources of growing the community, right? So that's the family unit. There is a very famous saying from the words of Allama S.S. Akhtar Rizvi, right? And he basically defines this as in his book, The Family Life in Islam. He says, nearness creates imminent danger of friction and conflict. Unless every member is told in unambiguous terms what his duties and rights are. So in Islam, it's very important that when we have a right on something, right, we need to also understand that we have a duty towards that right. So you can't claim the right and not perform the duty that is required with that right. And that goes especially with, all members of your family. Everybody needs to know what their rights are and what their duties are. Now, the definition of a family is basically a husband and wife, and then you have parents, and then you have children. That is the basic unit or the primary members of the family. However, there is the other relationships which come based on blood or family relationships, right? You have, terms such as those related with the womb or the blood, right? And then you have, near ones who you may be related to with regards to marriage, right? Or near relationships with other people, right? And that's where the term, silatul rahim comes, right? The rahma is the womb. So that's why they say silatul rahim, meaning you're having mercy on or keeping ties with your womb relationship or your blood relationship. And that's where the reverse term comes in, qatul rahim, right? So where you are cutting the ties of relationship. So it's very important, highly recommended in Islam to actually maintain silatul rahim, because that grows your lifespan. For example, especially in the month of Ramadan, is actually something very good to do. If you have not spoken to a relative for a long amount of time, it's a good idea to pick up the phone and give them a call and just ask them how they are doing. So you get that your lifespan actually increases when you do that. Now, some of the other members of the family would be your aunts, your uncles, your cousins, brothers, sisters, father's uncle, father's aunt, mother's uncle, mother's aunt, nieces, nephews. All those kind of become that secondary part of your family. Now, there are three different types of family systems. One is the extended family system or the joint family system, right? And this is a lot more, prevalent in the Indian, Asian culture side of it, right? Where you have the grandparents, right? And they are living with their married children, and then they have grandchildren. So everybody is living in the same household, right? There, the best part is that they share resources between each other, right? And you have a lot of support in terms of helping each other out. The second one is what is we are more, especially in the Western culture, and now it's becoming a lot more prevalent in countries like India and Pakistan, which is more the nuclear family, where the husband and wife are living out on their own, and their unmarried children are under the roof, and that's about it, right? So that's the nuclear family system. Some of the positives of the joint family system, for example, is that you don't have a sense of loneliness. You're provided with a sense of security, right? And everybody's cooperating with each other because you have so many hands that are helping towards the family cause. The negative part is that in case somebody's earning more, right, they are deprived of the benefit of earning more resources, right? So because it gets shared between the whole family, everybody gets the same share, they cannot take advantage of the extra money or extra resources. The other thing is it also breeds a sense of laziness in the other family members who may not want to carry their weight, right? And there is no sense of dependency, right? You cannot rely, because they're thinking somebody else will take care of it. So that's kind of the joint family system. The nuclear family system, one of the problems there is that the detachment can be to the point where it can reach a point of selfishness, right? I got my wife, my children, that's about it. I don't care about my parents, and I don't care about anything else. And it can go up to that negative point of view also, right? Now, Islam looked at both of these systems, right? And they said that we want to be something along the lines of a semi-detached family system. So what does that mean? A semi-detached family system is, or a semi-attached family system is, where you live in your own home as a wife and husband with your children. However, the rest of the family members also live in their own household, but the silatul rahim, or the relationship, is so much closer, and the love is so much closer, that Allah kind of defines that in Surah 24, ayah number 61. He says, you should feel comfortable enough to go do what, right? Eat food, right, in your own house, buyutikum, abaikum, your father's house, right, ammahatikum, ikhwanikum, your brother's house, right, akhwatikum, amamikum, your uncles, your aunts, right? Father's side, your mother's side, your aunt's house, aunt's, uncle's house, people's whose house keys you possess, or even your friends. So you don't have to. Now, of course, in today's time, it's a little bit more where, India, I used to remember just somebody would come knock on your door and they wouldn't even call you, right? And then you had the teapot constantly cooking because you're always serving tea to whoever's coming to your house. So that's a good example of that type of system, right? Where you feel comfortable enough to where you can show up to somebody's house to eat food without feeling what you call the takalluf word, right? However, the akhlaqi or the manners part, good manners part, is that you at least call them to check if they're home and so on and so forth. If nothing going on with them, especially in a society like US. A good example is that when Bibi Khadija and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So when they got married, Rasulullah used to live with Abu Talib, but they got their own home, right? Same thing when Imam Ali alayhi salam and Bibi Fatima Zahra salamullah alayha married, right? They also lived in their own home outside of, even though Rasulullah and Bibi Fatima and Imam Ali grew up in Rasulullah's house, they got their own home, right? And even in Kufa, where Imam Ali, used to live with his unmarried children, right, for example, but, Imam Hassan, Imam Hussein, and even Bibi Zainab had their own homes and families, right? However, they felt comfortable when Imam Ali would show up to eat at any of his children's home. So that's a good example. Another good example is, we recite that in our majalis every time, right? Hadith-e-Kisa, for example, we recite, where Rasulullah at that time had 8-9 wives, right? And instead of going to any of his, wives' homes, right, he felt tired, so he felt comfortable enough to show up at Bibi Fatima's house and ask for the kisa to wear it when he was feeling tired. So that just gives you an idea of the close relationships. Even though they lived separately, right, their hearts were so close that they used to not feel uncomfortable, showing up at each other's homes to eat, rest, or do things with them, right? Does that give you an idea about? So that's the type of art. The family unit, so then continuing on that discussion, comes on the basis of marriage. Now, marriage is what you call a highly recommended act in Islam. It's called mustab al-muakkar, right? It's a highly recommended mustahab act, right? In fact, you have the hadith from Imam Ali alayhi salam that, you don't complete half of your religion until you actually get married. So that gives you the importance of, the importance of marriage. And there is many hadith which talk about, people who shun marriage, and that's actually looked down upon. Now, what are the qualities of a good marriage? What do you look for in a spouse, right? You look for this is something very interesting, right? We've gotten so materialistic, right? First thing we do is we check for education, we check for the bank balance, we see if the boy has a job and a home, right? But those are not the criteria that Islam actually uses. The first criteria for a woman is actually she needs to be a chaste woman, right? She needs to be from a good family and she needs to be righteous. For a man, it's important that he is a chaste man, he has good akhlaq, and he's religious, right? Those are the criteria. So Islam is looking for, righteousness and akhlaq and good manners in their behavior, right? And somebody who's, fearing Allah and keeping himself safe from a lot of the bad things that are prohibited, right? And so now the question is, who proposes? Right, you're ready for marriage and you want to get married. Who's proposing to who, right? So it's traditionally, and this is in all cultures, it's usually the male who himself directly or with his family members initiates the proposal for the marriage. It's never the woman who actually initiates the proposal for the marriage. In fact, even in the West, right, where we live, you've seen it in a lot of places where it's the man who's supposed to get down on one knee and propose to the woman. So that just gives you an idea that it should be the man who should propose to the woman. And this is actually, even in nature, you will see, right? When you see a lot of the animals, it's usually the males initiating the part about trying to propose to the woman. A good example would be the peacock, for example, right? That is a good example of that, even in the animal kingdom, that's how it's kind of happening, right? And Quran actually emphasizes it, right? In Surah Nisa, ayat number 3, he says, then marry the woman that you like. So it's the males who are supposed to initiate that proposal. And then it's the woman's job to actually accept the proposal or not accept the proposal. That's how kind of it works, right? The other thing which has become a little bit more prevalent is when you accept the proposal, right, there is something called an engagement ceremony which actually starts happening. And now this is actually not a Islamic tradition, the actual ceremony of an engagement, right? However, right, as long as it's not violating any haram or halal and it's not against the Sharia, you can actually do the engagement ceremony. It's fine. However, it's not a contract, right? Because the only contract or the legal item is actually the marriage itself. It's not the engagement ceremony. And a engagement ceremony can be, or engagement can be broken off without giving any valid reason, because there is no rights or rules or regulations around an engagement, right? However, there are rights and rules and regulations around a marriage, right? Now, this is a very tricky question, right? So I'm quoting exactly how I've read it, right? So, how do you, look at the woman while she's wearing a hijab in a proposal meeting? So how do you go look at the girl, right? So however, so is this permissible, right, for the man who intends to propose to look at the woman without her hijab? Right? So you want to propose that, can you look at the woman without the hijab? The actual answer is, it is permissible in this case for him to look at her, right, at her hair. She can look at the forearm, which is like where you can up to the bracelets, and then the shank, where it's the part where you can keep the anklets on the leg, right? So you can see that. Now, however, this is allowed one time. So this just gives you an idea that, this is allowed based on Sharia, right? Now, let's talk a little bit about mahar, right? The nuptial gift or the dowry for the woman, right? And basically it's called the consideration that a man gives to the woman, right, in exchange for the marriage, right? Now, what is the meher, right? Now, meher is something that can, it is something that has an intrinsic value in the eyes of people, right? It could be things like actual money or property, for example. It could be, for example, a promise, right? Like, I promise to take you for Hajj, for example, right? That can be a mahar, right? It can be a benefit, like, I promise to let you use this building for a year, rent free, for example, right? Or it could be a work, right, that you would do in the case of like Nabi Musa, where he committed to, work for the father for 8 to 10 years, right? So you can do that. Sometimes it may be where you say, I'm going to go volunteer at a charity for 6 months. That may be the condition of the wife, right? Or teach the bride how to recite the Holy Quran. Could be anything, right? Some work that you would do, right? Now, is there a minimum or a maximum? The answer is actually no. There is no minimum or no maximum value for mahar. It can be even a mustard seed, as long as it has some intrinsic value in the eyes of people, right? So it can be no value, for example, right? Maximum, there is no maximum limit. However, right, it is mustahab, right, that it should not be more than the mahar as-sunnah. What is the mahar as-sunnah? Mahar as-sunnah is the mahar that was paid to Bibi Fatima alayhi salam, right, by Imam Ali when he married her. It was 500 silver dinars or coins, right? And each coin is about 2.5 grams. So it basically is 1,250 grams. I actually checked yesterday just to see what the price of 1 gram of silver was. It actually is 80 cents per gram. So the meher would be $1,000, for example. So that just gives you an idea. 1,250 grams is $1,000. The marriage ceremony, right? So now the marriage ceremony part. The marriage, by the way, the marriage is actually, in the eyes of Islam, it's a contract, right? It's actually a contract between a man and a woman, right? So it requires in Islam that you have to actually verbally agree on that contract. It's not something you write down. It's not something you wish in your heart, like I intend to marry, or it cannot be done by signage, right? Ishara, right? Except if the person is somebody who cannot speak, then they can do that, right? It must be based on ihtiyat-e wajib, Arabic language. If it's not, It's okay, right? You can still do that in a simple marriage. There should be no conditional things, right? But for example, I will marry you as long as my father comes back from Hajj today. So that just gives you a good example, right? You can't do that. Or I will marry you if it rains today. So you cannot have conditional things in the marriage, right? There is the part about initiating the proposal. So in the case of a proposal, it's the man who initiates the proposal and the woman accepts. However, in the case of a marriage, it's actually reversed. So in this case, the proposal or the ijab is actually initiated by the women's side. And then the man is the one who's doing the kubul. So he's the one doing the acceptance of the proposal, right? And from an ihtiyat wajib, again, the proposal should be on the side of the woman, and then the acceptance should be from the side of the man, right? Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wal asr innal insana lafi khusrin illa allazina amanu wa amilus salihati wa tawasaw bil haqq wa tawasaw bis sabr. Innallaha malaikatahu yusalluna 'alan nabi. Ya ayyuhallazina amanu sallu alayhi wa sallimu taslima. Continuing on this topic of marriage, right? One of the key things I talked about was that in a relationship, Allah has placed mawadda and rahma, love and mercy or compassion, right? Or kindness to each other, right? Now, I'm not going to talk about some of the Sharia part of the rules, right? Because, and this is a special warning for some of my male compatriots, right? That in a marriage, right, there are some Sharia rules, of course, right, and you have rights, but then that with those come the duties. And a lot of times, when we as males, right, we read some of these rules or read some ayahs of the Quran and we try to exercise that right, the problem comes is that the whole akhlaqi or good manner or mawadda or rahma perspective gets destroyed. The basis and fundamental of every marriage, as Allah says in the Quran, is rahma and mawadda, right? So we have to keep that in mind. Now, however, there is a ayah in the Quran in Surah Nisa, ayat number 34. Allah says, ar-rijalu qawwamuna alan nisa. So men have been placed as the managers. Now, some people say leaders, managers, right, in the affairs of women, right? However, this position is not like that of a dictator, right? You cannot take the ayah literally word for word and say, I am the dictator of the house, so everything I say goes, right? The akhlaqi or fiqhi perspective part of that is, you are supposed to provide good companionship, and the responsibility comes in being able to provide for your children and your family. That's really the managerial part or the leadership aspect comes in, because Allah repeatedly emphasizes in the Quran. For example, Surah Nisa ayat number 19, he says you should treat your wives kindly. Should treat your wives kindly, right? And then sometimes, happens you may not like something. So if you dislike them, right, then it may be that you dislike a thing, right, while Allah has placed abundant good in it for you. So you may have something where you may not like, where you're trying to exercise your right on that leadership part, right? But Allah is saying there are so many more good things I have placed in it for you. So you have to kind of forgive or look past that part and go into the good part of it, right? That's where the mawadda and rahma comes, right? Also in Islam, there's only two choices, right? When it comes to the Quran, right? When it comes to, there's multiple places Allah says, famsikuhunna bil ma'ruf, right? So, retain them with fairness, right? Aw farikuhunna bil ma'ruf, or let them go with fairness, right? Don't, either be with them with fairness or let them go with fairness, right? Don't adopt that middle route, right? There's another one which says, famsikun bil ma'ruf aw tasrihun bil ihsan. So treat them with compassion, retain them with maruf, or let them go with ihsan. So somebody asked, Imam Jafar Sadiq alayhi salam, right, what does the ihsan mean? Salawat. So Imam Jafar Sadiq says, fill her belly, meaning feed her, right? Clothe her body, right? And forgive her mistakes. So doing ihsan means to let go of the mistakes, right? That's what it is, right? And in Islam, right, both the husband and wife are blessed with this love and compassion, right? So the wife on an akhlaqi level is supposed to help, even though it's not a duty, but from an akhlaqi perspective, the woman is supposed to be helping in the house, right? A good example of this is that when the marriage of Bibi Fatima and Imam Ali alayhi salam happened, right? They went to Rasulullah, right? And they asked him, right, whose duty is what in the house? Who's supposed to do what, right? So Rasulullah very simply replied, right, that he said she will take care of whatever is inside. So Bibi Fatima is supposed to take care of whatever is inside, and he will take care of whatever is outside. Now, if you go read our traditions and stories of Ahlul Bayt, Imam Ali alayhi salam, you will notice, right, Bibi Fatima used to have this grinder where she used to, grind the grains, but then Imam Ali used to come and actually do the grinding for her. So there's a lot of stories where Imam Ali used to help with the household chores, right? So especially living in the West, for example, right, it's unlike where the Eastern countries where you can find servants or maid servants to come help with the household chores, right? In US, you cannot afford, or that type of service is not easily available. So the men are supposed to, from an akhlaqi perspective, help in the household, right? Help the woman in things that you are doing. Now, a little bit about a controversial topic, right? So I told you that so far I've been talking about all the good stuff, right? So this is a controversial topic that gets thrown at especially Muslims, right? And this is a ayah from the Quran, right? Surah Nisa, ayat number 34. It says that, what happens when there is, what you would call misbehaving happening, what is called nushuz, right? And nushuz means the misbehaving is happening when it comes to the rights and the duties that both the husband and wife are supposed to be carrying out with each other. So the ayah of Surah Nisa, right, it mentions about those women who are disobedient to you, right? And you fear that they will be disobedient to you. So the first thing that it talks about is first admonish them politely. Talk to them nicely, right? That's what the first thing is. If admonishing has no effect, then keep away from their bed. So sleep in a separate bedroom. Maybe that will pretty much, spur the point that you are really not happy about what is going on, and that's why you are kind of voicing your complaint, or you're letting them know. You talk to them, they didn't get it, now you're actually showing it in the action. And then, the lastly one is then gently discipline them. Right, the word daraba is used, right, like, which means hitting, but then daraba can mean different contexts, different things, right? Now, this part where, a lot of the male members of the society from thousands of years have taken this ayah out of context, and they said, daraba means you can physically hurt the woman, right? So that actually is not the case, right? And this is something that people have been doing, right? Imam Baqir says, the beating should be not more than the beating of a toothpick. So if you think of the amount of beating you can do with a toothpick, right? So that's the amount of beating. However, in the Western culture and where we live, right, it's actually not even allowed to hit somebody, right? So you pretty much practice the first two items, right, which is where you talk to her politely, or you voice your complaint in terms of sleeping in separate beds. And then, I talked about this ayah repeatedly, retain them with ma'ruf, or let them go with ma'ruf. Retain them with ma'ruf, or let them go with ihsan. So if it comes to the point where you cannot resolve it, then let them go with kindness and fairness, right? Don't go into this. Now, why the talk about the ayah of hitting, right? Why that daraba part, right? One of the problems was that in the Arabian society, if you go back 1400 years ago, the time of Jahiliyyah, right? The women were treated as property, right? And they had the same rights and levels as a slave. So, it was very common for practice for them to beat people up, right? However, Islam came in, and with this ayah, it actually introduced, two different conditions before you can actually get to that third part. So it was more a restricting ayah, talking about how to go about the process of fixing the misbehavior, versus hanging on to the last part of the ayah, which is talking about hitting, right? The The prophet says, this is something very important, so you got to go back and look at, how did the Ahlul Bayt, because they, when in Hadith Thaqalain, Rasulullah said Quran and Ahlul Bayt. So when you need an answer for what the Quran is saying, you got to go look at what the Ahlul Bayt are doing. So if you go look at Ahlul Bayt, right, and Rasulullah, he says in his hadith, he says, one of the worst persons is one who hits his wife and then gives her a hug. Right? And then there is another hadith from him. He says, verily, the best amongst you is one who is good with his wife. Right? And then he says, and I am best amongst you towards my wives. Now, there's a lot of stories about, how much Rasulullah used to actually treat his wives with kindness and fairness, right? Where he never actually went on to those type of things, right? Let's talk about a couple of the controversial topics too, right? Since, I'm into this controversial mode, I started the conversation with, the part about the abortion and those type of things. Simply put, abortion is not allowed in Islam. Right? That's the first and foremost condition, right? However, right, if the mother's life is endangered because of the pregnancy, right, then it is permissible to do the abortion. Right? So there's a danger to the mother's life, right? And in this case, it is permissible as long as the soul has not entered the fetus in the womb. Now, and what is that according to Islam? It's actually 4 months. So after 4 months, abortion is not allowed in any circumstance in Islam. So that's one of the conditions. Now I will give you a side note on this, right? So what if the child has been diagnosed with a serious physical or mental disability? So nowadays you can do the test, right, where they do the genetic test, and they can actually tell you if there is something going to be a problem with the fetus when it's born. So according to Ayatollah Sistani, he says she's not allowed to do the abortion unless and until taking care of such a child with disability will be extremely unbearable for the mother. So if taking care of the child, if you give birth to the child is going to become a problem, then you cannot actually, or then in that case, she can do the abortion. So that becomes a problem, right? But then, the question becomes, when you do an abortion, then what happens, right? So, when you do an abortion, however, you are supposed to pay diya, blood money. So it's not like, you can just get away with, so it's like a penalty, right, that you're supposed to do. And however, the diya is not in terms of the, the value of a human life per se, right? But it's punitive enough, and it's sort of like a financial compensation for a potential financial loss that may happen because of you aborting that life, right? Some of the rulings are that if you abort from example 0 to 40 days, if you abort from 0 to 40 days, you're supposed to pay about 69.12 grams in gold, right? If it's from 41 to 80 days, right, so the next batch of 40 days, it's 138.24 grams of gold. Now I said up to 4 months, right? So up to 4 months is actually 207.36 grams of gold. Now, we talked about that you can do abortion after the 4 months under some certain special circumstances. And by the way, the 81 to 120 days, there's also other condition, whether the bones have developed, whether there's flesh that has developed. So there's different penalties around that. And then if you do after, 4 months, the female fetus, right, it's 500 dinars, and I told you a dinar is 2.5 grams, so 500, so 1,250 grams of gold, or in the case of male, it's actually 1,000 dinars of gold. So that's how much that penalty. So the penalty is actually very punitive. If you go calculate, it becomes very expensive, right? Couple other things, contraceptives actually are allowed in Islam, right? In the US, there is a big push to not allow contraceptives, right? But according to Islam, the contraceptives is allowed as long as it does not harm the woman's health seriously. And in the case of contraceptives, the wife does not need her husband's consent for practicing birth control. Those are some of the rights that are there with the woman, right? Now, let me switch to somebody else, right, in this topic, right? And I think I have 3-4 minutes, right? So I'll talk about this, right? Uh, Bibi Khadija was a very rich woman, right? And Prophet Muhammad was around the time of age of 25. And she used to have these caravans that she used to take out for trade, right? And her caravans used to go, Layla fi Quraysh, right? Going to Yemen and going to Syria, right? During the time they used to take the caravans. And she was looking for somebody who was going to be an honest person to lead the caravan, right? And she actually approached Abu Talib alayhi salam, say, I heard you are an honest person, right? And would you lead my caravan for you? And at that time, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was 25 years old. Right? So he said, why don't you take my nephew, right? And he's honest, that you will find. Now, when he went there, took the caravan, right? He did the trade so successfully, right? And she had promised him like, good amount of money. And she said, I will double your wages if you're just honest about it, right? And so when he returned from the caravan, he actually, the way he did the trade, he doubled her profit also, right? And then she had sent a servant named Maisara with him to look at what his behavior was during the trade. When Maisara came back, he reported to her about all the good akhlaq and the good manners that Rasulullah was exhibiting during the trade. Now, of course, the marriage story, right? So, but I'm coming to my conclusion part of the statement, right? So, Bibi Khadija said, right, to Rasulullah that, I married you. So now I talk about good akhlaq and good manners, right? What is the most important thing about looking for in a marriage? It's not the money, it's not the education, it's not the bling of this world, right? You have to look for good akhlaq, honesty, trustworthiness. If you go look at the story of Nabi Musa, how he got married, one of the fundamental characteristics that the woman described was that he was capable of taking care of her and he was trustworthy. He was Amin. He was Sadiq. And that's what Bibi Khadija has told to Rasulullah, that I married you or I fell in love with you for your honesty and your trustworthiness. And by God, that you have actually exceeded that honesty and trustworthiness, right? So may Allah give us, right, this type of love or mawadda and rahma in our relationships, in our marriages, right? May Allah guide the male members to, make sure that they are presenting ma'roof and ihsan in their marriage, right? And then may Allah guide the women folk to actually, exhibit good akhlaqi manners by raising the family together with love and care and kindness between each other. May Allah give us the unwavering resolve, right, to stand up for injustice stand up against injustice, using the examples of the martyrs of Karbala wherever it may be found. O Allah, we ask you for all that is good in this world and in the hereafter. O Allah, we seek refuge with you from all evil in this world and in the hereafter. O Allah, we ask you for the good that your servant and prophet has asked you for, and we seek refuge with you from the evil from which your servant and prophet sought refuge from. O Allah, we ask you for paradise and for that which brings one closer to it. And we seek refuge in you from hell and from that which brings one closer to it. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Kul huwallahu ahad, Allahu samad. لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء والأموات. تابع بيننا بينهم بالخيرات إنك مجيب الدعوات إنك على كل شيء قدير. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما.